You hear periodically in the news, of course, of situations where a criminal organization or a terrorist group has taken someone hostage. And then you often see pictures or hear stories about the family and how they're dealing with the situation and hoping, of course, for a good end to this particular incident. There's an awful lot that goes on in the background that we don't get a handle on, whether it's law enforcement agencies or the military or security intelligence, or people like my next guest, who has been dealing with hostage incidents for quite some time now. So I'm thrilled to welcome to the podcast an old friend of mine, Rachel Briggs from the United Kingdom, who is a writer. And I have to mention, she was awarded the Order of the British Empire some time back, and is a specialist in hostage taking. So, Rachel, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, when I met you in the early 2010s, I was with Public Safety Canada in the National Security Directorate doing all things CVE or countering violent extremism related, having just spent 30 years in security intelligence. And you were with a UK outfit called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, or ISD, doing some work on counter narratives and things. How did you morph from that into working on hostage negotiations?
So there is a seamless track, I guess. And the story starts back in 1996 when I was a fresh faced first year university student in Cambridge and got the rather strange news and rather terrifying news that a family member of mine had been kidnapped in Colombia. And it certainly wasn't what I was expecting when I got the message to call home urgently. I was imagining somebody had a car accident, a heart attack, anything but really. And so that experience for me was very formative, and it sort of it it brought home to me. I mean, quite literally brought home to me the fact that stuff that happens overseas that we see on the news. I grew up in the era where, our evening news bulletins were dominated by the many hostages being held in Beirut, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And, suddenly all this stuff had come home to roost. And the bad things that happen overseas suddenly kind of came into my life. And so um, I took a great interest in what was happening around the world, and so it started with hostage taking. That's sort of, I guess, where things started for me, and thankfully my relative came home safely. Um, and along the way, I sort of found myself picking up new interest areas, and yes, as you say, finally finding my way onto the counterterrorism beat. Again, 9/11 was a formative experience as well. But they all fit together for me. They all weave together because ultimately the thing that interests me and drives me and is a real passion for me is the way that big stuff of national security, the stuff that you spent your whole career trying to work on, is not something that happens out there to other people.
Mm-hmm.
There are real human beings right here in our own home cities who are being impacted by it. So whether that was trying to work on, counter narratives with the Institute to try and stop British kids, turning to ISIS, or whether it's the work I've done with hostage families, helping them to get through a dreadful ordeal. It's that thread runs through it all, which is about the fact that ordinary people get caught up in other people's conflicts that are going on around the world, and it's really important that they get the support and the care that they need to stay safe and healthy.
You raise a good point about how this really is about people, right? These are not just numbers. These are not just statistics that you get in your news feed, that these are actually people who are suffering. And we know that unfortunately, in some situations, the incidents end quite tragically. You raised terrorism, Rachel. And as we've said, we did work together on counterterrorism for a bit. I think historically, traditionally, when one looked at hostage taking as a tactic, it's been around forever. I mean, it's not a 20th or 21st century phenomenon. One normally, I think, associated hostage taking with, either criminal organizations or something's happening in part of the world and a group decides to use this tactic to put pressure on another party. From your perspective, having worked in it now for the better part of a decade professionally and having had this personal experience with it, how would you, and this may be an unfair question, Rachel, but what is the sort of division, if I may, between what we would say a traditional hostage-taking situation versus a terrorist hostage-taking situation?
Yeah, so I would kind of expand the question a little bit, if I may, um,
Go ahead.
because I would say there are three types of hostage taking, and I tend to I tend to look at them based on one factor, which is what is it that the hostage takers want, not what is the identity of them, but that sort of plays into it. But generally there are hostage cases which are financially motivated.
Mhm.
And that can be not just criminals, but also terrorists. I mean, there have been sort of pretty wild reports of, the many tens of
Mhm.
millions that have gone into ISIS and Al Qaeda over the last few years from ransom payments. So, financially motivated kidnaps, whether they're terrorists or criminals, and then the second I would point to are politically motivated,
Mhm.
and that's certainly where a number of the terrorist cases sit very clearly. The other category, which I think we've all been a little bit nervous about calling hostage taking, but I very much think we should, and that is state hostage taking. I think about, it's two Canadian citizens right now who are being
Mhm.
held in China. Um, if it looks like a hostage and it smells like a hostage, it's a hostage in my book. And
Right.
there are Westerners who are being held in China, in Russia, in Iran, in North Korea, and a number of other countries around the world who have kind of figured out that picking up innocent Westerners and holding them um, another way to put pressure on their adversaries, and it's a good way of doing that without starting a full scale war. So if you're Iran, easier to pick up a few Westerners and hold them and use that as leverage over the UK or the US or Canada, than it is sort of starting to activate your military might, which is going to engender a response which is pretty predictable. So I would say there are those three types of hostage taking, and I think it's really important to include the third in that. And in terms of the balance between the three, which I think is one of the things you were kind of getting at. I mean, actually, the vast majority of kidnaps are financially motivated and they're conducted by criminals.
Right.
The stuff that makes the headlines is the really messy cases, and they tend to be the terrorist cases that can't be settled financially.
The ones that go badly, in other words.
The ones that go badly, the ones where the terrorists kind of figure, okay, we're not going to get money for these guys, so what else can we get instead?
Mhm.
Publicity, propaganda,
Mhm.
material that can help with our recruitment, that can keep our troops on side. There's many other ways that terrorists can use hostage cases, quite aside from either being paid cash or having changes of policy and so on. And of course, the most awful example of that was the spate of kidnappings of Westerners by ISIS in
Mhm.
2013 and 2014. I mean,
Yes.
the graphic, hideous, I mean, there's no other word for it, images that we saw were just truly shocking. And they got more than money from out of those cases. So in short, the vast majority are never seen. They're settled quietly behind the scenes through the transfer of money, anything from a few $100 to many millions of bucks, depending on who's
Mhm.
being held. And the ones that dominate are the ones that get very messy and end badly.
Right. I'm really glad you did raise the case of the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. As a Canadian, obviously, this is an incident which has been dominating our news here in Canada for the better part of 2.5 years now. And the inability, and I'm not using that term unfairly, of the Trudeau government to figure out a way to do this. But you're right. The Chinese government is acting as a state sponsor of hostage taking. There's no question about that. So we agree that the vast majority of cases do not make the headlines, and that may be a combination of pressure put on by the hostage takers themselves to not want to make this public. And you're right, terrorist groups want to do it for propaganda purposes. I imagine too that there are cases where families don't want this to be made public, either to shield themselves from public attention, media attention, etc. Now, you were involved in dealing with families in this regard. Now, obviously, your accent betrays you. I'm sorry, you are a UK citizen.
Yeah,
Uh,
Raj.
you just you decided to move to the United States to set up an organization called Hostage US. So, what was behind that decision?
So I had been involved in setting up Hostage UK, which is actually now Hostage International, and I'll come back to that. But I'd been involved with a group of folks, principally led by Terry Waite, who was one of those
Of course.
held in Beirut. And he figured when he was released after 5 years, most of which was in solitary, I mean, it's unimaginable. He figured that, yes, of course, he had a lot of healing and recovery and so on to do, but he recognised very clearly the plight of his family, and they'd spent 5 years not entirely devoid of support. Of course, they hadn't, but there are very specific types of support that families need during one of these cases, and I'd be happy to maybe have a chat about that in a second. And so we together, a group of us, set up Hostage UK to meet those very, very specialist needs of families and hostages. And why did I move to the US? Well, the reason I moved to the US is because we'd set up this thing, Hostage UK, thinking we were going to be helping, British families and British hostages, and that's what we would do. And we very quickly found that we were being contacted by folks from many different countries, and clearly it was easier to help where there was a common language. And
Right.
so, Hostage UK for years had been supporting Americans, Canadians, Australians, and many other nationalities. Where a there's vast swathes of the world where actually people's English is better than ours, embarrassingly. So we were able to do, and we do a lot of our work remotely. So there was a little bit of a barrier, but we were able to do a considerable amount. So all of that is to say that we had been getting some insight into the situation in the US, and it became very clear to us that there was a need for a similar type of organisation to Hostage UK in the US. And a number of things happened at the same time, coincided to the stars aligned, if you want to use that saying, to make it happen. And certainly there were the Syria cases that I mentioned earlier. One of the American families, the Foleys, whose son Jim was the first American to be murdered by ISIS, had been in touch with us, and Jim's mum Diane is an extraordinary woman who has literally moved mountains over the last few years, and she'd seen Hostage UK in action and sort of said, where's mine? Where's my Hostage UK? I'd also been supporting a number of American families and had seen them battling, literally battling with their FBI points of contact, and, good people trying to do a good job, but really with little situational awareness of what families go through, and, without training into how to support people who are going through very difficult times. And was kind of appalled actually by some of the stuff I saw. And there was one particular family that I felt very strongly that they were not getting the support that they needed. And it was frustrating for me because I was doing what I could, but ultimately that relationship that a family has with government is critical. And it's really important that it's strong and close and trusting. And so I'd sort of been frustrated. And anyway, to kind of cut a long story short, around that time as well, largely, I should say, prompted by Diane Foley's tireless campaigning, President Obama announced that he was going to launch a review of the US hostage policy machine. Now, he took the question of ransom payments off the table, so there was a slight elephant in the room, but otherwise his government took a 360-degree view of how they were doing stuff. And I and Hostage UK were involved in inputting to that and helping to advise and so on behind the scenes, as many people were. And their report card on themselves was not good. And so coming out of the back of that, there was a real momentum from within the American government to do things differently, and a real desire for something like Hostage UK to happen in the US. So there was families like the Fowlers who were fighting hard, raising tons of money for us to be able to do this. There was a government, with open arms, wanting to cooperate with this tiny non-profit run by a woman with a strange accent, and there was very little else. There was no dedicated organisation, shall I say, that like Hostage US as it became, and I wanted to go and do it. I feel very passionately about these issues, and it was a very delicate procedure to translate something like this model we'd created in the UK into another country, and so it was important to me that I gave that some time and some care.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned, Rachel, and this is that in the United States at the time there was some frustration in some cases about the relationship between, let's say, the FBI or the law enforcement agencies that was trying to deal with the situation in the family. My wife and I have just finished watching a UK series called The Bay, which takes place. I believe it was filmed in Kent, but it's a seaside town, and the main character is what they call a family liaison officer, someone that a police officer is tasked with interfacing with the family on a variety of issues, usually in the wake of a murder or some kind of a tragic event. I can imagine that this is a delicate thing. The law enforcement agency is trying to resolve the hostage taking to the best of its ability. The family, of course, wants to find out as much information as possible as soon as possible, so that they're kept in the loop. And yet, I think it's this delicate dance between that. But from your perspective, could you see, and of course I'm biased in this regard, coming from the law enforcement / security intelligence world, did you see that kind of difficulty in two parties that both want the same end but are seeing it from different perspectives?
Oh, for sure. I mean, at a very basic level, there's a simple case of lost in translation. I mean, everybody's talking different languages and coming from
Mhm.
different perspectives. I mean, the big difference, and certainly in the UK, we have this family liaison officer model. And the family liaison officer, is their principal job actually is as an investigator. I mean, they are there to be a police officer, and they have special duties additional to that. Um,
Mhm.
and it's in hostage cases actually where they drop that responsibility of investigative sort of role, because of course this person's being held overseas, and there's almost never any suspicion that the family in the UK or the US
Right, of
is,
course.
is, is involved in the case. And so certainly what I've seen in the UK is that role has emerged and developed and professionalized over the years. And I think there's a very, very healthy training and educative program which is ongoing across the UK. And there's an understanding that um, family liaison officers who work on hostage cases are a special category, and they need special training. And certainly when I was running Hostage UK, we were sending along our people, maybe some of the hostages we'd supported, to go speak at those courses, so that the police officers who were acting as family liaison officers in hostage cases kind of had that human perspective. So it's a very specialist job, and it takes a special kind of a person who's got tremendous amounts of empathy and emotional intelligence, but is cool-headed. And I mean, it's a bunch of stuff that shouldn't really live together in a sort of personality type. But
Mhm.
some extraordinary folks I've worked with over the years. I mean, your question is spot on, because there is an inherent tension in all of this, because you have a family that wants as much as possible, and a government, broadly speaking, whose instinct is to give as little as possible, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I two things I would say on that, and one is that um, there are certainly, and you would know this much better than I, of course, but there are certainly some bits of the intel picture that just can't ever be shared. And actually, most of the families I've worked with of any nationality kind of get that, and
Mhm.
they know that there's going to be stuff that can't be shared, because it would give away you know assets and all sorts
Hmm.
of details that could be tremendously dangerous to people risking their lives, if nothing else. So most families get that. I think the thing I would say is that I think there's often an underestimation of families in these cases.
Mm.
Because actually, if you think about who's involved in a hostage case, there's the police, there's the government, there's, the specialist negotiators, there's the family. Think about that whole universe. There's only one set of people who have got no other interest than the safe release of that hostage. And that's not to underestimate the commitment of intel officers and police men and women and all that good stuff. But there is only one set of people who've only got that interest. And in my experience, if they are treated as grown adults and trusted, I've seen governments share way more than I was expecting.
Hmm.
And those families absolutely respecting the confidentiality of that information, because you bring people into the tent, you trust them, you help them to understand why the confidentiality is really important, rather than just saying no, 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 no. And they start to be really careful custodians of that information. And they realize that, a slip of the tongue, the word in the ear of the wrong person actually could put their loved one's life at risk. So
Right.
there is, your question goes to the heart of the tension in these cases. And I guess my experience is that it's actually a counterfactual that's true, and
Hmm.
that if everybody can just sort of put some of their training to one side and some of their instincts to one side, actually, there's a really important partnership to be forged there. And I'll just say one other point on that as well, which is, you know, the sort of no, no, no approach of governments to families just doesn't hold anymore,
Hmm.
because the thing that has changed is social media. Now, when I was going through this in 1996, if I had wanted to break the story and spill the beans, I mean, I don't even know where I would have started.
Hmm.
You know, and it's a, don't get me wrong, it's a juicy story, it's a hostage case. I wouldn't even have known where to have started. Today, I'd have just had to have tweeted it.
Exactly.
And so for government, it's even more important today that governments trust and bring families into, around the table as partners, because there isn't that control mechanism anymore.
Hmm.
And just sort of saying no, 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 we're not telling you anything, is just simply not sustainable.
You're preaching to the choir here as somebody who has deliberately chosen to talk about security intelligence in the wake of my so-called retirement, despite the fact we were told, well, I was told for 3 decades, thou shalt not say anything to anybody under any circumstances.
Yeah,
And you do raise a good point about social media, Rachel. This is a completely uncontrolled universe, as we're seeing with the difficulty in taking lousy stuff off like child porn and terrorist propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me you're absolutely right that, you know, in my experience, and I worked with some very, very, very sensitive intelligence in my career, there's actually very little that should not be released under any circumstances because of the damage it would do. The vast majority of stuff, of course, is either already known or is no big surprise kind of thing, right?
yeah.
You've been talking a lot about families, and obviously they're the ones with the sole interest in getting their loved member back. Can you walk us through? And this is maybe I may ask you to sort of generalize to a certain extent. What do families experience when a member of theirs is being held hostage somewhere in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. And the thing that I guess most people would immediately guess, and they would be absolutely right, is that they're very scared. Their loved one is being held by person or people who are not good, and they
Hmm.
have very bad intentions, and they're often being held in conditions where, even if the hostage takers don't decide to do something bad to them, a drone may drop, a
Hmm.
etc., and that might be the end of it. So the one of the overwhelming feelings is being scared. And that then has there's a whole sort of series of things that flow from that, and other things, which end up having quite a physical impact. So, the not sleeping, the adrenaline that is sort of charging through your body in quite strange ways, which is kind of all at some points and none at others, which can have really weird impacts on, your ability to concentrate, your ability to maintain routines and structure, and so on and so forth. So there's some kind of, it's not just all in people's heads about being scared. It also ends up having some sort of, strange physical manifestations as well, and the cruelest of which is, of course, sleep, because there's a reason that's used as a form of torture. I mean, it's and when that is night after night after night after night for not just weeks, not just months, but years, I mean, it is so debilitating. So those are a couple of sets of issues. It's like being on hold, because there's this big thing going on, and you just sort of feel like you can't go on as normal. Partly because your routines are disrupted. You might be jumping on a train to London at a moment's notice, or taking an urgent call about the case, or providing proof of life questions, or stuff will be coming up, but you're sort of playing this awful waiting game. And a lot of families end up putting their lives on hold, and part of the reason as well why they do that is because they feel terribly guilty. I remember the wife of a hostage saying to me at one point, she said, "I'm even feeling guilty taking a shower because I know he won't be able to wash." And so the idea that you could see friends, that you could have a glass of wine on a Friday night, that you could go to the cinema like you usually did every first Tuesday of the month, or whatever those nice things, that all of that goes. I know there was a sibling of a hostage who, talked to me about the fact that she couldn't read anymore. I mean, read literature, all that stuff that happens at the front of your brain, which was the final bit of our brain to develop, which brought to us all of the lovely things in life, like music and literature and philosophy and stuff. That bit of your brain just kind of collapses, because it's all focused on the back bit, the primitive bit of your brain, which is the sort of survival bit. So there's bits of your life which just shut down because you don't want to do them, or you can't physically do them. And that's before you even think about some of the more material impacts that this can have. The number of hostages who don't get paid while they're being held hostage.
Yeah.
We've dealt with families who have quite literally been on the brink of losing their family home. Because dad, husband's, big salary isn't being paid anymore, and mum is trying desperately to keep the family home, but that's not going to work on a part-time salary as she's bringing up 3 kids.
I can imagine, Rachel, it's hard to interrupt, that there probably isn't a standard hostage policy that any corporation or public sector or organization has in place, but surely to God, if that an employee of yours is being held hostage for a period of time, there have to be some instances where corporations or governments are saying, we will continue to pay this person's salaries. I mean, it's not this person's fault they're not coming to work; they've been held hostage. I mean, is it really that bad?
It depends who you work for. So if you're working for a big corporation or a government, for example, in most cases you will carry on being paid. If you're working as a freelance journalist,
Oh.
If you're working as a consultant for the UN, I've seen folks whose the project's ended. There's no more money in the pot. There's plenty of folks who unfortunately don't have the luxury of a sort of a stable, what we would traditionally think of as a stable working life, and that's fine while you are working, but it's suddenly not fine when nobody's going to file that piece.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
So and to go back to what I was saying earlier about the need for something like Hostage International, Hostage US, these are really, really specialist problems. And we've never as organizations had a sort of a tick list of services,
Mm-hmm.
because what you might need might be us to try and desperately find a benefactor to cover your mortgage until this is ended, or pay off
Mhm.
the mortgage, which we've managed to do in some instances. For others, it's, we helped. I'm just trying to think of an example. We've helped. Here's another great example. Wife of a hostage has a car accident, calls the insurance company. Can I speak to the policyholder?
Ah.
And I can't even tell you why you can't speak to the policyholder.
Oh, wow.
Policyholder is hostage is not one of the options on the drop-down menu. And surprisingly,
Wow.
so that's what I mean about this sort of sense of your life being on hold. I mean, it's like somebody in your family slipping into a coma overnight. That's probably something that's a little bit more relatable for a lot of people. They're not there to sign the paperwork.
Mhm.
They're not there to answer that question. They're not there to do the security questions on the online banking. I mean, I've supported, spouses of hostages who are still sort of secretly managing to log into his or her bank account because they've still got the password, but they're
Right.
terrified that at some point the bank is going to figure this out, because a lot of families still have antiquated ways of organizing the money, and
Of course.
it'll all be in his bank account or her bank account, which most of the time doesn't matter, but in these instances clearly it does. So it is yes, the overwhelming feeling is being scared, but then you layer on top of that the psychological impact, the physical impact, the potential financial ruin, and the way in which tasks which in any normal time are simple and straightforward suddenly become completely impossible. And so having an organization like the ones that I helped to set up and run around that are relentless problem solvers, is absolutely essential.
I can't imagine anybody, in their checklist of things that might go wrong in your life, having one of my husband or my child being held hostage is anywhere in the top 10. So as you said, it kind of just it hits you in the face and all of a sudden you have to deal with it. You mentioned Terry Waite, Rachel, and of course he was a very famous, British citizen who had gone to Lebanon to actually help, I believe, if memory serves me correct, with other hostage situations when he in turn was taken hostage by Islamist extremists in Lebanon. And as you mentioned, I think he was held for 5 years before he was finally released. So we have this situation where the families are dealing with this very, very difficult set of circumstances. And then if it ends positively, which of course everyone hopes that it does, the hostage eventually comes home. Can you walk us through what that set of circumstances is like? I mean, aside from the obvious joy that, person X, Y, or Z is now back in the family fold, there must be a whole set of other sort of pressures or, I don't know, related developments that transpire in that regard.
So let me share a phrase that a former hostage shared with me, which just sort of put it brilliantly. She said, you have to survive captivity, and then you get home and you have to survive survival.
Wow.
Uh,
Survive survival. What an
it,
interesting phrase.
it's a great way to describe it, because, of course, you are free. That is wonderful. That is the best news in the world. But then a different challenge starts. And so, and again, the journey for each hostage is unique to them. But certainly, some of the things that are very common, um, physical problems. So you may have, like Terry, not moved in many years,
Right.
so you don't have many muscles left that have to be rebuilt, or you may be extremely malnourished, which can be coming back from malnutrition can be very dangerous if you don't do it carefully.
Of course.
You may have been tortured. There may be physical wounds. Perhaps you were rescued and injured during the rescue attempt. So there are all sorts of physical problems that can arise, which need urgent, fast, and then sustained support. To things like malnutrition and muscle wastage take a considerable amount of time to address. Um, Dental problems, bad breath is one thing, but having not cleaned your teeth for 6, 12 months is, nasty things can happen.
Of
Um, and,
course.
and you've certainly got no sort of recourse to treatment. So dental issues often get forgotten, but can be very painful and difficult. So physical, dental, I mean, psychological as well, of course. And it's a bit of a misconception that I think people will assume all former hostages will go on to have PTSD. Well, in fact, the human brain is very resilient. And
Hmm.
a phrase that a really good psychiatrist I know once said to me was something along the lines of, most people get better most of the time. Most people who've had a problem most of the time
Hmm.
do most of the healing on their own, sort of thing. And there are some who will go on to need counselling, and there are some who will end up developing PTSD and will then need, a sustained support to deal with that, which is difficult in a country like the UK. I don't know so much about Canada, but getting access to mental health support here is really
Hmm.
difficult. Um, so there's that side of things. There's then, just like the families, I mean, there's all sorts of practical issues. I mean, I kid you not, when I was in the US, we spent 2.5 years trying to get the right person in the IRS, the Inland Revenue System,
Hmm.
cancel fines that had been imposed on a hostage for late filings because they were held hostage.
Oh my
And as soon as we found the right person, they said, "Oh my goodness, of course. Let me just tick a box and it's done."
God.
But it took my colleague Liz 2.5 years of
Wow.
battle, 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 and operator says no, and you're back to square one. So, try doing that when you're suffering. And so having somebody with a calm head helping you with that kind of stuff. And then I guess another of the things that can be really overwhelming is dealing with choice suddenly.
Mm.
A former hostage sort of told me the story about, getting home, and I think her husband had said, we're going to go see your dad. Do you want to fly via Colorado, Denver, Colorado, or via, Tucson, Arizona? And she said she locked herself in the bathroom and wept because you just couldn't deal with that. Somebody else tells a story about, panicking about having to choose their pizza topping over dinner.
Wow.
It's really overwhelming. So, the road, as I say, that phrase, you survive captivity, but then you have to survive survival. And that journey can take, for some people, many years, and it might be many years because it's prolonged
Hmm.
mental health issues. It might be many years because you're battling the IRS for 2.5 years.
Wow.
But most hostages do recover with the right kind of support and can go on to live great lives, but they do need that help and specialist support along the way.
Is there also an issue, Rachel, with the fact that once a hostage incident is so called over, the person has been rescued or released or whatever, returns to the family fold, and then essentially you're kind of on your own again because the international attention isn't there because they figure, okay, happy ending, right? So and so is now back United States or Canada or United Kingdom. They seem to be doing okay, and then they not only does the world's media attention move on, but everyone else just seems to think that, okay, let's wash our hands of this, congratulate ourselves. We've got the t-shirt. Is that also an issue that people now have to, in many ways, you talked about the presence of specialists, whether it's psychological specialists or financial specialists, whatever. Is there an adjustment with, being, and this is the wrong term, and I apologize, the center of attention to all of a sudden being back on your own again?
Um, I think I would. There's definitely an adjustment issue. I think I would. I think the main challenge is not so much. You're no longer in the limelight, and the limelight can be great sometimes because it's a distraction from your recovery,
Hmm.
right? And that's hard work. Recovering is hard work. So, um, but it is, you're on your own. I mean, you've been on your own as a hostage, clearly, but you're on your own again. I mean, also think about the dynamics you're walking back into. I mean, your family, in the majority of cases, of course, are delighted you're back, but they've been through this as well. And so, question, how much energy have they got to really slog through the recovery? And it can be really hard for families. That the being reunited on one level is wonderful, of course it is, and it's overwhelmingly wonderful. But it's also really challenging because go back to our earlier conversation. You've got the wife or the spouse or the parent who's not slept for 12 months, has struggled with car insurance companies, is at their wits' end. Finally, you're released, and all of that comes out for that. They've now got to recover as well. So it's a really really tough situation. And one of the things that is so hard to see when you work in this arena is the couples that break down afterwards. I don't have any statistics on this, but I've seen an awful lot of post-release divorces, and maybe for some people that was ended up being the right thing, because maybe they reflected while this was going on. But I think for many it's probably about the fact that um, all parties are fragile and at their wits' end and haven't got any energy left. But everybody needs support, and there's nowhere to go get it. So being reunited is ultimately wonderful, but it's not straightforward either.
It has its own pressures.
Exactly.
In all the years you dealt with this, Rachel, I don't know if lessons learned is the best phrase to use, but did you come up with things that you eventually learned were not good things? In other words, you call them mistakes or whatever. What did your experiences teach you about? Is there an optimal way to deal with these situations, or is it really it depends on every situation? Of course, is different given the circumstances. But were there some general principles that you were able to come up with that you could apply in most cases that proved to be more effective than others?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. So I guess I would point to a few things. Number one, having that independent source of support is desperately important, because everybody that is in the sort of the eye of the storm is exhausted, and so having people who are just close enough but not actually within that is really important. So that would be one. Number two is just how important it is to make sure that the people who are doing this support work are properly trained.
Mm-hmm.
We really undervalue this kind of work, not just in the hostage space, but whether it's palliative care or
Mm-hmm.
nurses or support teachers in the classroom. The people who do that really really important support work are often, we just assume that it's a certain temperament or it's a certain personality. No, it's hard work, and you need to be trained properly. And one of the things that became really important for me in that leadership role was not just making sure that those folks were trained, but that they were properly supported,
Mm-hmm.
because it's really hard work. And if you don't have somebody to debrief with after you've had a really difficult conversation with a former hostage, if you don't have somebody ultimately being able to offer you perhaps counselling, if you're really struggling as a supporter. So making sure that role is properly valued, properly supported, and ultimately has resource behind it is really important. And each person is an individual. And as I said, I think I said earlier, as organizations, we've never we have a list of things we can do, but we've never presented families with a sort of a tick box list of
Mm-hmm.
services,
Mm-hmm.
because it's better to start with a conversation. I don't do much of this work anymore, but I would always, when I was starting a new case and I had that I would sort of make sure I knew the bare bones of the situation, but then I would stop, because I thought the more I try to learn about this, the more I'm going to make assumptions about who this person is on the end of a phone line or in front of me, what
Mm-hmm.
they need from me. And I always took the view that I needed to listen as much as possible and really hear what
Mm-hmm.
they were saying, rather than projecting onto them what I assumed they might want or need or might be worried about. Um, and meeting everybody as a new, fresh human being,
Mm-hmm.
and responding to exactly what they need, and not making assumptions about what would seem obvious but might not be what they want at all.
I have to ask this, Rachel. You mentioned that you don't really, I guess, do this at all or as much as you used to. it must be exhausting for you as well. I mean, emotionally, intellectually, personally. I don't want to push, but is this maybe one of the reasons why you've elected not to be as involved as you once were? Did you sort of get to a point where you thought, I've given what I can give, and it's time for someone else to sort of take up the ball and run?
I would say yes and no, and I'm kind of one of these people who's not at all squeamish about talking about this stuff because, again, going back to our conversation earlier about unnecessary secrecy, it's really important, and I always took that view as a leader that it was very important for me to say when I wasn't coping, because how on earth can I expect my team to do that or
Of
volunteers
course.
to do that if I'm Mrs. Stoicism and strong Rachel and so yeah, it's really really tough work, and over the I guess 15 years that I was doing this work, I had some really tough times. I mean, when a hostage doesn't come home,
Mm.
or when you see a family collapse, um, you can't help but be impacted by that, and sometimes
Take it personally, I assume.
and you can't and you can't predict what it is that's going to really impact you either, and it
Hmm.
could be that something which yesterday I would have kind of not brushed off but been able to deal with and process and move on from. Next week, if I've got if my marriage is in trouble or if I'm worried about money, then suddenly that same incident could impact me much more seriously because I've got some underlying challenges that I'm dealing with. So it was difficult work. It was incredibly rewarding work. I mean, being able to do something tangibly to make a difference to somebody who's going through something that is just awful, is a wonderful feeling. And but yeah, it's difficult work, and I think that the reason I said yes and no is yes, absolutely, it's been difficult work, and it can't help but take its toll on you in different ways, right? But the reason I said no as well is because I'm a really big believer that organizations have to evolve and change. And I really, really enjoyed my roles helping to set up both organizations and run them. And certainly, moving to the US to do it, I was able to take a set of lessons learned with me and try some new stuff. And that was great, and I loved it. But I really do believe that it doesn't matter how good you are at your job or how good you think you are at your job, putting somebody else into that job
Hmm.
will bring something new.
For
And
sure.
so I wanted to, it was never going to be something that I was going to do forever. And already with both of my successors on both sides of the Atlantic, they've taken the organizations into places I couldn't have done because they've got different skills, different experiences,
Hmm.
different knowledge, and that's as it should be. And it's time for different challenges, and it's great knowing that I've played a part in helping to create organizations that can sustain. I mean, that's the holy grail in nonprofit terms, isn't it? So
Well, in any terms, right? The ability to build something and then hand it off and see it prosper. There's a certain sense of personal satisfaction that you help build that, but also the confidence, as you said, that your time is in doing that is pretty well up, and you sort of pass the torch on to somebody else. So, last question for you, Rachel. Given the fact you did this for the better part of a decade and a half, any thoughts on hostage taking in general? I mean, is it morphing into something else? Is it growing internationally? How do you see the next 5 to 10 years? If I know you don't have a crystal ball any more than I do, but based on your experiences, can you speculate on maybe where hostage taking is going as a phenomenon?
so I would say to point to two things really. Number one is I fear that state hostage taking will continue to grow, um, because there's a number of countries who are figuring out it's being effective, and there's some really interesting developments led actually by your own government. There's a Canadian initiative on against arbitrary detention, which is the sort of the international community's way of calling state hostage taking. Um, but I do fear that's going to be around for a while, and that states like Iran realize there's some benefit to it for them. So I'm worried about that trend, and I really hope that the international community can get their act together. And that's an initiative that I'm trying to get very involved with, and throw my sort of knowledge behind for what that's worth. And then the second thing is, post-pandemic. I mean, we know that there's going to be, recessions and problems in many parts of the world, as there are already, right? And we know that hostage taking, like most types of economic crime, grow in those circumstances.
Of course.
And I know tons of people who work in the business side of all of this, in terms of negotiators and so on. And business isn't looking bad at the moment for them, and they don't say that with any glee. But they know that when places like Latin America and parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East suffer financially, then unfortunately, criminals find other ways to make money. And so I do worry that there will be a resulting, one of the other dreadful after effects of the pandemic could well be hostage related.
I fear you may be right in that regard. Unfortunately, we're already seeing a little uptick in migration because of the economic downturns after the pandemic. We saw a bit of a respite there for a couple of years, especially you in Europe, where you were getting the tens of thousands of people leaving Africa and the Middle East to try to come migrate to Europe, and tragic stories of boats capsizing and such. And then it kind of eased off for a bit, but you've been reading in recent weeks where it seems to be on the uptick. Rachel, I think we could go on for days talking about this particular phenomenon, which I do see as a national security problem, not just because it's possibly terrorist groups that are carrying hostage taking, but also criminal organizations as well. So, first of all, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Secondly, thank you for your own personal commitment to dealing with families dealing with this tragedy. From the bottom of my heart, it's an amazing commitment on your part to have done that. And thank you very, very much for sharing some of your ideas in this regard.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to join you.
So that was my conversation with Rachel Briggs, who headed up Hostage UK and Hostage US. What do you think about our conversation? What do you think about hostage taking and how it should be dealt with? You can reach me on email borealisrisk@gmail.com or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. Also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like this content, want to get more, go to the website borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get free daily digests of podcasts such as these, shorter quick hits podcasts, perspectives, today in terrorism, etc., as well as a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. Love to hear your feedback and your views on everything that comes out from the website. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.